Good morning, and thanks for joining us for this edition of FCW Bookshelf Live here at the Acquire Show. I'm really excited to talk to today's guest, David Locke Hall, who is the editor of CRACK99. And we're going to talk about several books here over the next couple days, but David, this is the one that I would recommend that people take to the beach with them this summer, because it's a great read. And before we get into some of the questions I have, could you talk a little bit about just how this came to be? The experience that you were involved in your role as a prosecutor, how this ended up on your radar, and what was the case that prompted this book?
Sure. I'm a retired federal prosecutor, and this book really is about my last case in the government, which started in December of 2009 when a Homeland Security agent named Brendan Cullen called me around Christmas time and said he had just been out at a company called Analytic Graphics Incorporated, AGI, and he'd been giving them a brief on how to avoid being targeted by international arms dealers who are trying to procure weapons and weapons components. And after the brief, one of the compliance officers at AGI said, "This isn't exactly what you were talking about, but I'd like to show you something weird." And he showed him a website called CRACK99.com. And what was weird about the website, in addition to its appearance, from AGI's point of view, is that this website, which appeared to be hosted in China, was selling AGI's premier product, which is called Satellite Toolkit, which isn't authorized for sale in China. And so they were wondering if Brendan could help them with this issue. So Brendan called me and said, this seems to be a crime, but what exactly can we do about this? And so we decided to initiate an undercover investigation.
And what year was that?
The very first contact with AGI was December of 2009, and he called me in that same, immediately after his meeting out there, and then we made our first undercover buy in January of 2009, January of 10. And
from then, we'll get into the details of the case, but just to sort of put the start and end points on it, it was from 2008, 2009, and then to the final conclusion, the prosecution, if you will. How long are we talking here, all told?
Well, from that first phone call in December of 2009, our undercover investigation was about a year and a half. So we arrested Zhang Li, who was the operator of the website, in June of 2011, and then he finally ended up pleading guilty in January of 2013 and was sentenced in June of 2013.
Okay. And you said it was just crack99.com. You hear a lot about things being on the dark web, but this wasn't hidden. This was just out there to Google and go.
Absolutely right. It was not on the dark web. And in fact, he didn't want to be on the dark web because he was trying to maximize sales to a broad audience.
Right. But it's not that broad of an audience. When you hear about software piracy and intellectual property theft, a lot of people sometimes sort of tune it out because someone's getting the Game of Thrones without paying for HBO, or they want to get music or maybe a video game that they got the pirated version. But CRACK99 had a very different niche.
That's very true. CRACK99 was not selling sort of retail software and audio and video products. It was selling very high-end, very sophisticated, very current industrial-grade software, which had a number of applications, including a number of military applications.
Right. And give a sense of who would want to buy this type of software. It's not the sort of thing that you or I would want to go get. Who's the target audience for these?
The target audience is primarily sort of, I guess I would say, in the engineering sector, and it's the kind of software being sold is the kind of software that's going to be purchased by really large defense contractors, but they're not really the target audience. The target audience would be the smaller companies and independents who are, who might be, subcontractors or vendors to those bigger contractors, but it's sort of like the layer below the top tier defense contractors. A lot of the applications, for example, were, for spacecraft design, aircraft design, really advanced communication systems, computer-aided design, precision machining, things like that.
Yeah. And is that what caught your attention as saying this is a case we wanted to go explore? Because clearly there are software piracy cases. Again, do a Google search and you can find a target. So what put this on your radar as being worth the effort? Because it wasn't an easy case to make, either to go investigate or to convince your higher ups that this is worth the time.
That's true. And we immediately saw, a national security implication. And actually, when I say immediately, what I mean is even in terms of AGI and their product Satellite Toolkit, which is used for tracking satellites in orbit, we were concerned about the idea that this software was just sitting on a server. Apparently, it was sitting on a server in China and was available for anybody anywhere in the world to buy. And by the way, for less than pennies on the dollar.
Right.
I mean. Back then, a license for Satellite Toolkit might have cost $150,000 just for one seat, but Zhang Li was selling it for $1,000, which is what we bought it for. So we were concerned about that, but then as we looked at the thousands of other titles that were listed on CRACK99, our concern grew because we could see, this wasn't just one software product being offered, it was a wide range of really high-end software.
Right. And you, in the book, you talk about the different projects that it supports, military helicopter project, Marine One being the sort of showcase example, but this is software that's being used to develop all sorts of military platforms.
Right, and it just shows how software dependent the whole economy has become, including, the military, but the software is used to drive other software. I mean, it's all part of the infrastructure, and this was very much the kind of software that makes up our, industrial infrastructure and therefore our military infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about sort of this ecosystem that CRACK99 is part of. Where was Zhang Li getting the software? He wasn't just buying it and selling copies of it.
Well, I'll just take a step back and say that the first stage in our undercover investigation was to buy software from him to see if it was really he could produce what he was offering, and in fact he could. We then did email search warrants, and we were hoping that by doing email search warrants of his U.S.-based email accounts, that we'd get an answer to that. Because we were wondering, like, how does this guy end up with all this? Thousands of titles of this software. And we didn't learn through the email at all where he was getting this. And the only clue we got as to the origin was what he told us when he was arrested. Initially he wanted to cooperate, but he stopped cooperating in the summer of 2011. So, we only got so far in terms of getting his, point of view. But he said he got the software from a multitude of different sources on the internet. He denied being a hacker himself, but he said he did get the software from hackers who sometimes would just post it online. He could get it for free. Sometimes he would buy it. But he learned about different software and their availability through fan groups and other internet forums. And one thing we learned through our undercover purchases and our interactions with him is he was very current. He could get, for the most part, he could get current versions of the software, which surprised us.
Yeah. Now, in addition to being a career prosecutor, you had 30 years as a military intelligence officer in the reserves. And as I read this, I sort of got the impression that both of those professions and skill sets wove into the investigation. Was it that national security threat that really drove you, and were there sort of intelligence gathering, approaches or techniques that you found were useful in this investigation, or is being a prosecutor and being an intelligence officer in this context sort of an overlap?
Well, there certainly is a certain amount of I found in the two careers, overlapped in a number of ways, and it's not hard to see, the interest from both points of view. But but I think my perspective was probably, as a prosecutor, was probably shaped by my experience as a naval intelligence officer. I mean, I found the national security implications concerning, but of course there are also, the national security interests weren't just related to specific military applications of the software. That there was also a broader sort of strategic concern, which has to do with content theft generally and the loss of American IP to China, which is enormous.
Yeah.
It's been characterized as the greatest transfer of wealth in human history by General Hayden. So.
Yeah. Now, it's, correct me if I'm overstating this, but some of your colleagues didn't seem to see the urgency that you did in this. Can you talk a little bit about how just the internal process of getting the approval and the resources to pursue this investigation played out, and where you ran into turf battles with other agencies? We had the potboiler investigation story here and the cyber crime side, but you also have the government fiefdom story woven through this. So if you could talk about that a little bit, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, anybody who works for the government understands, rice bowls and, and turf. And there are issues like that I think hobble, I thought then, and I still think hobble the government. One is the question of what investigative agencies can have primary responsibility. Mm-hmm. I gave a lot of thought to whether or not this might, when we first opened the case, whether or not this might be an espionage case. Ultimately, I decided it was unlikely because, even if an intelligence, for example, even if the PLA had stolen the software to begin with, it's not customary for intelligence agencies to then go resell what they've obtained by intelligence means. But sort of more importantly, from my point of view, my concern was if I opened it as an espionage investigation, it would become an FBI case. And I didn't want that to happen for two reasons. One is that the agents I was working with, who, including Brendan Cullen from HSI, were excellent agents that I'd worked with for 10 years mostly on Iranian arms procurement cases. And I wanted, to work with them on this one. But the other concern I had is that the FBI does not have a good record of turning espionage investigations into espionage prosecutions and actually locking people up, which I think is what you need to do in a law enforcement context. And so that was, one concern. The other issue is just that this kind of case with a foreign offender who's physically overseas who's committing offenses that are not routinely prosecuted. Criminal copyright is not a common prosecution. Interstate transportation of stolen property based on software that's been hacked and sold abroad is not commonly done. So at the beginning of this case, it was sort of a long shot, and getting support for a long shot in the government is really hard. With the government, and particularly once you get into the political sort of level of the government, what they're interested in is low-hanging fruit. They want easy, reportable, bite-sized cases, and that's not what this was. So at first, I didn't tell anybody I was working on it, and then when I did, the reaction I got was, "Oh, nice," and there
but
really
good
wasn't,
luck with that.
there really wasn't a lot of enthusiasm until the press conference, and then there was.
And so there was a lack of enthusiasm, but you didn't get pushback saying you shouldn't do this.
No, that's right, and that's why I waited. I waited till we had some successes to report to actually go overt within my own organization to say, here's what we're working on, here's why it's important. Right. I wasn't necessarily trying to get enthusiastic support. I just didn't want anybody to say no.
Go do something else, sure. And when you made the case as to why this was important, did you focus on the criminal side, on the national security threat? In the book, you sort of scope out in the opening pages of, here's sort of the worst case scenario of this widespread theft of intellectual property falling into the hands of enemies of the United States. Did you take that level, or did you talk about, look, here's here's this criminal operation and we should shut it down because it's our job to stop criminal operations?
It was all the above.
Yeah.
I was trying to make the case on all those levels. I'm not sure it really resonated. I think I did it better in the book, but but at least it was sufficiently credible that nobody said, stop doing that and go do a cocaine case.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't just the proprietor of this site, although I think we should come back and talk about him a little bit, because the professionalization of this, maybe not the look and feel of the site, but the customer service and the ability to go procure products that someone came and asked for. It doesn't sound like you're what I would think of as a criminal enterprise, but I think increasingly that's the case with software theft, that you have, software theft, identity theft. You have these places where you can go swipe a credit card and, and they have terms of service and they'll give you your money back if you're not satisfied. And, so maybe before we jump beyond Lee, we should talk a little bit about him, and as you got to, I say know him loosely, but got to learn more and see how this operation was working.
Yeah, we did get to know him, pretty well during the undercover investigation. I mean, and our objective was to gain his trust, and we spent a lot of time talking to him via Skype, emails, phone calls. Building a relationship. And he was a businessman. I mean, he was really focused on money. His first question was, when we first sent him an email, the first response was, "First, send me the money," and then he gave us the instructions on how to do that. But he was very much focused on his business, and he thought like a businessman. He also realized, and this was important to us because this is something we would have. We knew we'd have to prove one day in court. He also knew that what he was doing was illegal in the United States, and so he was, in that sense, he was acting like a criminal because he was trying to be careful not to do anything to get caught. But otherwise, he was, very much focused on his profit margin, which was pretty substantial. And
was it a one-man operation? I mean, I know he was part of a larger network, and in terms of procuring the software and working with other, stolen software vendors. But did he have a team of his own, or was this really just him?
I would say, I mean, he was really, an independent operator. His wife worked with him to the extent that she picked up the money at Western Union. Mm-hmm. So when we sent the money, it was, to her, in her name, and then she would pick it up. But he handled everything else. You mentioned customer service before. He was very good at customer service. I mean, if we had a question or if we had difficulty applying the crack or downloading the software, he was really helpful in terms of getting us to do that, getting us to accomplish that objective. And that showed us that he really knew a lot about cracking. Now, he denied, both being the hacker and being the cracker. In other words, he denied being the person who was disabling the licensing files. But he did participate in a broad, and assuming that's true, by the way, he did participate in a broad network. So he said he employed what he called master crackers who were cracking the software. And he, again, as I mentioned before, he said he dealt with hackers online, to obtain the software.
Okay. And as you prosecuted this case or investigated this case, you were mapping the email transactions and who else was purchasing software, and it led you to other criminals around the world, but also to customers in the U.S., including at least a couple who worked for the U.S. government. And you talk a little bit about who else you rolled up in this, and I think it does a good job of explaining why this matters beyond we stopped an online store for illicit products.
Once we arrested Jiang Li, we were interested in knowing something about his customers and trying to figure out if they too had been knowingly committing federal crimes. So we, mainly using the results of the email search warrant, we identified all these U.S. customers and Brendan Cullen sent out leads to all sorts of different offices within the United States to suggest they pursue these targets. He actually sent, along with that, he sent them a first draft of a search warrant so that they wouldn't have to do any work. And the response was really disappointing. There was, and I don't know, exactly why this is, but the only customers who were prosecuted were the ones that we prosecuted, and we picked two to prosecute. One was his, sort of best customer in terms of volume in the United States, a guy named Ronald Best, and the other was a NASA engineer named Cosburn Wedderburn.
Right.
And we prosecuted both of them. They ended up pleading guilty, and Wedderburn actually cooperated against Zhang Li.
And they both, in some way were buying this cracked software to use in their jobs, in their government jobs or in sideline businesses doing the same sort of work, right?
Yes. Wedderburn was a NASA engineer, and he had a side business at home as an engineering consultant. And he appeared to be buying the software online for his engineering consulting business. Best was an employee of a defense contractor, and he was acquiring the software for work, for his work at that defense contractor without his employer's knowledge. He claimed that the kind of software he was buying was simulation software, and he claimed that his employer didn't like using simulation software, which is sort of on its face not a very credible, claim. And the employer absolutely denied that, and in fact pointed out that they have a program for employees to purchase software that they need for their jobs through the company. But he was buying it, and then he was running simulations both at work and at home, using this cracked software, which had a number of implications in terms of not only the fact that he was committing a crime, but also when you use cracked software, you run the risk of introducing malware into your network.
Right.
And we were very concerned, given the kinds of contracts his employer was working on, about what kind of malware might have been introduced.
Right, and that just really struck me, at a conference like Acquire, we're talking about acquisition, and something you hear about is managing the supply chain and supply chain risk, particularly in hardware. But as I was reading this, it sort of sounded as though we need to do a better job of managing the supply chain of the people and the subcontractors and the tools that they're using, that just as manufacturers need to know what sort of products are going into that router that they buy and put in a government network, if, you have a contractor and their sub is using software that they bought off of CRACK99, that introduces all sorts of risks into the process as well, leaving aside the fact that they're criminals.
It's true. It's like any cybersecurity issue. You need to look for the point of least resistance. And, there are a number of famous, non-military cyber incidents that involved access through a vendor, even really unlikely vendors like HVAC vendors, that kind of thing. So a rogue employee who's buying cracked software illegally online could be one of those points of introduction.
So when this case culminated with regard to Lee, there was a sting that involved you guys going to Saipan, is that right? And talk a little bit about how you worked up to laying that groundwork, enticing him, building the trust, and then just mainly walk us through what happened when you guys were on the ground.
Well, one of the things that's challenging about a case like this, when you're talking about an overseas offender, is you might be able to acquire a lot of evidence against him by means of email and Skype and recorded phone calls and the like. But how are you going to arrest him? Right. We don't have a good relationship with China. We don't have a partnership with Chinese law enforcement, so we can't do what we might be able to do in other countries, and that is partner up with the foreign law enforcement agencies to make an arrest and then extradite to the United States. So the reason we were trying to build up trust with him was to get him to agree to meet with us in person so that we could arrest him. And So we had identified a number of different places, a number of, foreign countries where we thought we might have good luck obtaining cooperation with local law enforcement to do an undercover meet, and also to succeed in extradition from that country to the U.S., which is, always an uncertainty.
Right.
So we told him that we were going to be making a trip, that we traveled annually through the Pacific Basin, meeting with business partners. We'd like to meet with him, and we gave him a few options. And one of the options we put in there was Saipan, and to our delight, he chose Saipan. And the reason we were so happy about that is that Saipan is a U.S. territory, right. So there would be no extradition necessary. There's a judge who literally flies circuit, and goes to Saipan every so often. So we figured out when he'd be there, and picked that week as the week we'd have a meeting. The reason Zhang Li was willing to come to Saipan was that the U.S. government has a visa waiver program for Saipan. So Chinese nationals don't have to get the visa they would need to get if they're coming to the mainland United States. And there are also a number of Chinese-owned resorts right. there. So he showed up in June of 2011. We had an undercover meeting and arrested him.
Excellent. Excellent. I have a couple questions about where we go from here, but I want to make sure we leave time for questions from the audience. Anyone have questions for David? Yes, sir. Let me restate that for people who couldn't hear. Just, did this lead to other investigations? There were the prosecutions of the customers, but did this help put you or colleagues on to other piracy cases that the government's been able to roll up?
Well, first of all, we did take down all the websites that Zhang Li was operating. We forfeited them and took them down. But in terms of other websites, my hope was that was going to happen, but it hasn't. It's just between you and me. That's why I wrote the book. I'm hoping maybe somebody will do some more of this kind of thing. But the reason is they're hard cases, and as a practical matter, it is difficult to get the government to take on the hard case. I mean, they're much more interested in the easy case, but there's no escaping the fact that these are always going to be hard cases because they're unusual charges. They require a certain amount of forensics. Lawyers are not, and I'm certainly not a computer scientist. I mean, I try to be pretty overt about that in the book. I'm not a coder. I don't know how to crack. I just know what cracking is. But you need access to people experts who can tell you that kind of thing. But the most important issue is that the offender's overseas, and that means you might never get him. So we could have done, all this work, and that this was what we were probably the most afraid of, after a year and a half of this, when we were sitting on Saipan. I was sitting there with Mike Ronayne, who's a Homeland Security agent. We're sitting in a car outside the airport waiting for Zhang Li to come out, and we're just thinking, I hope he shows up. We're going to look pretty bad if he doesn't. So that's those are the obstacles, but in my opinion, this is where leadership comes in. That if senior leadership starts saying to prosecutors and agents, this is a priority, you need to be focusing on this, I'm sort of a Pollyanna optimist, and I'm hoping that it'll get better.
After 30 years in government, you're a Pollyanna optimist.
Still,
that's good.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Yes, sir. Question. Yeah, that's just can private companies who are really losing the most to these hackers, can they help support these efforts, whether bankrolling them or giving air cover in other ways?
They can support them. Ultimately, it's the government's responsibility. Private companies can be helpful. They can't actually bankroll it, but a lot of big companies have units that are focused on protecting their IP, that do their own investigations to identify infringements, to take action against infringement. I spoke to somebody in the general counsel's office of one of a big company, and that does software and hardware, and who heads up their unit. And I said, well, what kind of success have you had with the government? Like when you go to them and say, you know, you've got all this information, you've identified an offender, the answer I got was, well, the first question they said they always called the Bureau, and the question was always, was there anybody locally that we could go after? And what they're just not getting is that the nature of this problem is global. This is not a convenient crime. You know, drugs, you can always find a local guy to arrest. That's not going to be hard. But, you know, software piracy and this, you know, and content theft in general, you're probably going to find, there are people in the U.S., don't get me wrong, but you're going to find a lot of people overseas. So they're always difficult cases.
Yeah. Other question? Yes, sir, in the back. Yeah, the question is there a governmental and legal framework to go after these crimes that are so international in nature? And that gets to one of the questions I had for you, which is what can and what should government be doing to better deal with this? Because I think you make it pretty clear that you think we're not dealing with it effectively or assertively enough.
Yeah, your premise is correct. International crime is not limited to software piracy. I mean, all kinds of other crimes some of which have nothing to do with cyber that are truly global in nature. And in my opinion, these are some of the more serious, crimes that the federal government should be investigating. One point I try to make in the book, I spend a chapter talking about something that really has nothing on the face of it, has nothing to do with Chinese cyber piracy, which is Iranian arms procurement. And the reason I'm talking about that is that the agents I worked with on CRACK99 were agents that I'd worked with for 10 years on tangible arms procurement investigations, mostly originating in Iran. And the techniques and of course those are all by nature international investigations, and they're very difficult. When you open a file, you cannot expect you're automatically going to be making an arrest. But we did have a great deal of success in making successful cases in that context. And so I think it's relevant that the people I was working with all had this kind of international mindset. They weren't afraid to go after an overseas offender because we had done it successfully before. This is why optimism matters. They'd seen it happen before. They were willing to keep an open mind and go after this guy. And that's why I think we succeeded in this case. Sometimes you just have to keep pressing, and we did. We pressed for 1.5 years.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? I want to challenge your optimism a little bit. And
don't do that.
No, I know. It's early in the day. And you spent years taking out a huge supplier of illicit intellectual property, and it's great. It's a great story. It's a great success story, but that ecosystem that's out there of other vendors, wasn't there the issue that there might be, that you hear about? If you take out one drug cartel, the others just move in to take the territory. Did other CRACK99s just pop up and start selling the software, or have you seen the type of niche, high-end engineering software, is that less available now as a result of this case?
I'd love to be able to tell you that we had solved that problem, but we definitely did not. Right. I mean, this is just one guy.
Sure.
And so I don't want to, cause anybody to become pessimistic, but it is a big problem. I mean, you can, don't do this from your work computers, but you can Google, some of the software products that I mentioned in the book and then put China next to it, and you'll see what I'm talking about. I mean, and of course, I've pointed this out to the government that that's a lead. I mean, that's like, well, there's your next website right there. Why don't you open up, a case on those guys? So again, it is difficult, but I think what we showed is that it's not impossible. And so, if I were, king for a day, there would be files opened on all those websites, and it's not just China, by the way. I mean, you can Eastern Europe, Russia, the number of different places, and use this as a playbook and just start making contact with these overseas operators, and I think they'd have some success, and I think it would have a chilling effect in terms of deterrence, because then people overseas wouldn't feel as safe as they do right now. I mean, I don't think people overseas are running these websites are particularly worried about getting caught. I should also mention that's not the only answer. There are other things that we need to be doing too.
That's what I want to get to. That there's more prosecution, more aggressive prosecution is great, but there are only so many prosecutors like you who are going to dig in and do this, and you can't do it alone. So what in your conclusion you talk about we all need to be engaged, and there needs to this needs to be taken seriously at the highest policymaking levels. If you were king for a day, what would you want to see change to give your fellow investigators a greater chance to succeed?
Well, in terms of law enforcement, I think high level, top cover would be helpful. In other words, real, sincere support from the bosses to the people who are doing the work. An expectation that you will be doing this kind of thing, and if you're an experienced prosecutor and you're doing all these low-hanging fruit type cases, that's not acceptable to me as the U.S. attorney. That would be a good speech. There's an important role for diplomacy here. Putting pressure on countries, to include China. Difficult, I know, but I'm an optimist. So you keep trying, you plug away, you try to make inroads there. There's also a role for the private sector too. I mean, a lot of companies do engage in self-help, but some don't. And they don't because it costs money. It's potentially embarrassing because it could result in public disclosure of cyber vulnerability. And there are a number of reasons to not be aggressive, but there are also a number of reasons to be aggressive, just in terms of protecting your IP. And there are some evidence that some U.S. companies are getting more aggressive about, for example, going to the International Trade Commission, bringing private lawsuits against the U.S. subsidiaries of foreign countries that are of foreign companies that are involved in this kind of thing. So I see more of that. I expect to see more of it, and I encourage it.
Yeah. And what about folks like us? We have a fair number of people from the private sector in the audience, also a lot of government professionals. Are there things that can be done at the individual agency level to at the very least better secure their own efforts? I keep going back to Ronald Best and the fact that he was using the software and it was feeding its way into important defense contracting work. Are there ways to better secure that, to be able to ensure that your contractors and your subcontractors and their workers are not using these illicit products? Are there ways to sort of clamp down on the demand, I guess? Yeah,
there are, and I think it needs to be more of an emphasis, within the government. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that there is no overarching federal strategy for this. There needs to be, but at the more tactical level, individual agencies need to be focused on getting their own houses in order. I mean, the U.S. government's record in terms of cybersecurity is not very good, and in fairness, I mean, they're the biggest target. I mean,
right.
If I was a Chinese, if I was a PLA officer and my job was to hack, OPM would be a good place to start. So it is a difficult cyber security problem for them, but it needs to be resolved. There are a number of things. There's a great deal that's happening. It's, I think the government's a little late to the game, but there's a great deal that's happening that's on the right track. And I also think there's a lot that's happening just sort of at the peer-to-peer level in the private sector. I see companies putting more pressure just on each other directly to not just to meet a minimum legal standard, but to actually be secure. Mm-hmm. Companies are realizing that they're trusting other business partners with information, with their data, and they need to really ensure that it's secure. And I have more, just now that I'm in the private sector, I have more clients coming to me saying, what can we do to actually make sure, we have a contract that says you will be secure in storing our data, but what can we do to actually make sure that they're being secure and they're following good practices? And that, I see more and more of that, and I think you can expect to see more in the future.
Great. Last call for audience questions. Excellent. Well, here in a minute we will break, and David's is here to sign books. Everyone should have gotten a copy as you came in. I also want to remind folks that we're doing more of these later this afternoon at 2 o'clock, I believe. Be talking to Pagan Kennedy, the author of Inventology, about sort of what it takes to really bring new ideas and inventions into the workplace. And we've got 2 more tomorrow, and I'd encourage you to come back for all of them. David Lockhall, thank you very, very much for doing this. It was a great conversation.
Yep, good. Good to meet you.